If you break down the word astronaut, astro translates to star and naut means sailor. Connect the two parts together, and you find that astronauts are literal star sailors. Today, the astronauts and scientists working at NASA and private entities like SpaceX are casting a wide net for future exploration. Over the next decade, plans for several missions to the Earth's moon, Mars, and beyond are in the books. One of these includes the Europa Clipper program, which is set to launch in 2025 and will take 6 years to reach Jupiter's orbit. Once there, the unmanned spacecraft will circle the gas giant in order to examine Europa, one of the planet's moons. This target is special because, unlike the rocky landscape of our moon, Europa has an extremely smooth surface that's believed to host a saltwater ocean underneath. It's been estimated that there's 3 times more water on Europa than Earth, and this creates ample opportunities for complex life.
A consequence of these vents at the bottom of Europa blasting heat, blasting hot water, blasting nutrients into the ocean is that you actually get chemical energy. So water's touching rock, and that's pretty exciting if you want interesting chemistry to happen. And there's organics in this ocean, so you have nitrogen and carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. Those 3 things together are basically everything you need for life to have taken hold. It's the most likely place in the solar system beyond Earth to harbor life, and not just single-celled organisms, but conceivably complex life. Maybe fish, maybe sea monsters.
That's David Brown, a writer and author of The Mission. Brown has spent the last 7 years researching and writing about the intricacies of Europa and the quest to make this mission a reality. Over the last 2 decades, NASA scientists have presented many cases for venturing to the icy moon, but other missions have taken priority time and time again.
Politically, NASA doesn't get a lot of money. It's not a well-funded agency. People think it's 30% of the federal budget. Really, it's 1/2 of 1% of the federal budget. And of that, only 25% of that tiny amount goes to planetary exploration. A consequence of that is NASA has to pick its priorities on where it explores. You could explore, for example, Mars, which is, and I use this word relatively, it's relatively easier to explore Mars than it is to explore Europa. And we're very good at exploring Mars. So if you're NASA, you don't have a lot of money, and you have the opportunity to go somewhere, maybe it's better to go with the sure thing and the place where astronauts are eventually going to land versus what could be considered a high-risk environment. One of the challenges that the Europa team has had to overcome over the years is minimizing the risk, both to cost and simply the survival of the spacecraft.
Another barrier that's made Europa seem far-fetched? It's not possible for astronauts to physically land on its surface, and this deviates from NASA's main focus of ultimately sending humans to the places they're studying.
The moon itself exists in what's called the Jovian radiation belt. And when you look at the sky at night, you can see Jupiter. It's like a little point of light. But if you could see the radiation belt surrounding Jupiter, it would be 3 times larger than our full moon. It's enormous. And Europa marinates in it. A consequence of that is the conditions there are not unlike the immediate aftermath of a detonated thermonuclear bomb. It's very inhospitable to life. An astronaut would land there and die pretty much immediately.
Even most of today's robots wouldn't be able to survive the harsh conditions for long. The high level of radiation on the surface and surrounding Europa can break down objects fairly quickly. This is why the Clipper spacecraft will be fully armored in heavy radiation shielding and will instead orbit around Jupiter itself, gathering data on Europa each time it flies by.
Scientists figured out a way to orbit Jupiter instead of orbiting Europa, so it doesn't have to marinate in that radiation with Europa. It can dip in, zip by, collect its data, and then zip out. And while it's circling Jupiter, it can point its antenna back at Earth, return all that data, and then encounter Europa again. An effect of this is the more times it encounters Europa, the more ways in which it circles it, eventually it'll collect a 360-degree view of the world, just as if you were orbiting it. And further consequence of it is that the spacecraft is going to last a whole lot longer and might have greater utility down the road.
At the end of the day, NASA is a federal agency that operates on a tight budget. The lifespan of each spacecraft and the mission's probability of success are key to its final approval. Fortunately, today there are also new players in space exploration that add to the mix. Elon Musk's SpaceX is just one example of a private company that's opening up opportunities in space.
The great thing about the commercial sector, the private sector, is that they are lowering the cost of access to space. They're very good at it. The private sector is great at doing things related to space that have a good profit motive, and launches are one of those things. But ultimately, this sort of pioneering science, there's not a lot of money to be made in, for example, exploring the oceans of Europa or flying in the skies of Titan, one of Saturn's moons. That's the sort of thing that the government is good at. And once the government sort of sets the stage, then the private sector can come in and ultimately find a way to make money. Remember, we've been exploring Mars since the 50s, and only now are we finally saying, hey, maybe this is the sort of thing the private sector can ultimately colonize. They can land people on there. They can explore in a real way and make some money with the resources there. It takes time, and so far the process seems to work, and we're going to see in the years ahead what SpaceX does, what Blue Origin does, what all these different companies do. But there's certainly a role for them there. There's a role for government, and they can work in harmony. A SpaceX rocket is likely the rocket that's going to launch Europa Clipper, which is the spacecraft in the mission.
So, what's the end goal for the Europa Clipper mission? Brown says it starts with figuring out the moon's key characteristics, like the thickness of its exterior ice shell and the composition of the ocean underneath.
Unlike the Earth, for example, which has experienced multiple extinction-level events, Europa, to the best of anyone's knowledge, has not experienced one of these sterilizing events as the Earth has experienced. So whatever's in Europa's ocean, if life did in fact take hold, would be highly complex. I mean, it could be quite evolved. So it'll be interesting to see what it looks like when humankind finally gets a look at it.
For many generations, scientists have theorized what creatures completely unrelated to us may look like. How would they act? What, if any, familiar characteristics might we find?
All life that we, as human beings, really all life as any creature on this planet Earth has ever encountered, all came from a common ancestor. We all came from some moment in the history of Earth where life began, and we evolved forward from there. Europa would be unrelated to that. If we found life on Mars tomorrow, it's very possible that that life was contaminated from Earth. Some asteroid impact millions of years ago kicked up some sort of debris and landed it on Mars, or vice versa. Maybe Mars was teeming with life and it ended up here. Whatever's on Europa almost certainly began independently. Well, what does that mean when we talk about life?
The first part to answering this question begins with the Europa program in 2025. Once scientists get a clearer understanding of the moon's surface, the next mission may be to send a landing spacecraft that would last long enough to thaw into the ice. Brown says that once you get 10 centimeters into the icy terrain, the danger of radiation fades.
The spacecraft itself, without going into crazy technical details, would essentially be a giant microscope, and it would study the sample that it thaws into the ice, and it would be able to determine whether life is on Europa. That's the immediate future. Beyond that, there are things like melt probes that are still in development, they're more like so crazy it might work ideas rather than something that you would actually put into blueprints and start manufacturing. A melt probe might be a passive radioactive source that just through its natural decay would heat itself and slowly melt into the ice and eventually plunge into the ocean below. But there are an awful lot of engineering challenges that come with that, and we just don't know how to do that yet. Europa Clipper is going to make all of that a lot easier, and that's why the mission is so exciting.
Earth is a blip in space and time, and there's so much humans have yet to learn about the vast solar system that surrounds our small, fragile planet. We've just barely scratched the surface. To find out more about Jupiter's intriguing moon Europa and the people behind the upcoming launch, check out David Brown's new book, The Mission. You can also find more links, resources, and archives of past shows at viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. Coming up on Viewpoints.
A group of whites ended up dragging him to death behind an automobile right in downtown Tulsa.
The horrific tragedies of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Then,
there's so much in the world that we couldn't see in any other way except using statistics.
The pros and cons of living in the era of endless information. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.